Cool. Is this thing on? Hello. I'm not going to talk about VHX. I'll talk about Simple. So quickly, before I get started, how many people here, I know how many of you have cut your cable, that's me. I know how many people here have know 20 by 200, that's me as well. How many people here are Simple customers right now? Holy shit. That's awesome. How many of you would like to be a Simple customer? Okay, given that you're such an amazing audience, and I'm really daunted to be up here, shoot me an email if you've already signed up, josh@simple.com. For everyone here who's at XOXO, we'll make sure it happens really quickly because I think it's a really awesome experience and I hope you all like it. All of that said, this is not my remote. I'm not actually going to be talking about banking today. What I'm going to be talking about is learning about stuff by breaking stuff. I was speaking to Chris Poole in the break earlier and he said he wished he could give a talk at a banking conference because it's such a boring audience and this is like the complete opposite thing. So I'm not going to be talking about banking, I'm going to be talking about learning about stuff by breaking stuff, and the real message that I want you to take home with you today is a message I think you've heard a couple of times, which is that you shouldn't let your fear of not knowing how things work or breaking something stop you from getting started on something you want to do. So how did I get started? I got started with this telephone. The phone system in Australia used to be owned by a big government monopoly. It was a lot like the Bell system in America. Everyone got the exact same telephone. You could get different colors. Most of them were beige, but I've got a red one here. And the great things about these phones is that they were really easy to take apart. You could unscrew the mouthpiece, you could unscrew the earpiece, and being sort of an analog rotary phone, the internals were kind of easy for sort of a 5-year-old dorky kid to sort of hypothesize about how they worked. So I started taking apart all the phones around my house and it was a hell of a lot of fun. Up until about 6 months later when I realized that if you're playing with the guts at the inside of the phone while a phone call was coming in, you'd get a bit of a nasty shock. And so my parents were kind of dismayed by this and they wanted to find a better channel for my either creative or destructive tendencies, maybe a bit of both. And so they took me, my mum actually took me to the local phone exchange and said, hey, do you have any broken parts that we can give to my son to play with? And I said, sure. And I came home with some broken phone bits and every couple of weeks we'd go to a different store, get broken electronics and broken machines and I'd take them home. And so I'd often take these things apart. Very occasionally I'd be able to sort of put them back together. And on the rarest of occasions would I be able to fix something that was actually broken. But the great thing for me was that these were my toys when I was growing up. These were the things I had to play with. A lot of people now sort of dismay how chemistry sets and electronic kits are no longer being played by kids. I mean, they were around when I was a kid, but the entire world is like this great kit that you can play with. And that's what I want to be talking about today. So I graduated from phones to this Apple IIc computer. This Apple IIc sort of came into our life, yeah, it was a cool computer. Came into our lives in this really weird way. My mother was an educational video producer and Apple had loaned her this computer for a video. And Apple never took it back. So we had it sitting in our house in a box. And I was kind of like, can we open it? Can we take it? It's like, no, Apple's going to take it back. And after a couple of months, we realized that Apple was not taking back this computer. So I had a computer to play with. Now that was awesome because it came with a computer, it came with a screen, it came with the floppy disks for the operating system, it came with a manual, but it didn't come with any programs. And so, you know, like probably a lot of us here, we had to teach ourselves how to program in BASIC or the Motorola, was Motorola chips in those days? Anyway, the assembly code. And here's a photo of me being a cool kid in the 80s programming on a green screen, which I think is a really shared experience for a lot of us here. I then graduated to the Amiga 500, another really awesome machine, like it. And this was a great computer. It was one of the first computers with a graphical operating system or graphical interface. I really only include this photo as graphical evidence of the fact that I used to have hair. It's something that I miss fondly. And it's also evidence that I've inherited my father's inability to take a photo in focus. So that is what it is. This is where the trouble really started for me. I'm getting some knowing smiles. This is mandel.bas. It came with, I can't remember which version of DOS, someone here will probably remember. And it was a program that came with the version of DOS. You could run it. It was a basic program. And if you ran it, after a while, this would appear on the screen. Now, at that point, I was a pretty good basic programmer. And I could look at each line of code. I could understand what each individual line was supposed to do. But the program itself was only like 20 lines long. And despite understanding each individual line, I didn't see the connection between the program and what was coming up on the screen, because there was this really complicated, beautiful thing that would happen when you ran this program. So I turned to my uncle. Uncle Mike is a professor of physics, and he was a big mentor for me in my tinkering. And I said, hey, Mike, why does this happen? Why does this program do this? And he gave me an answer that has kind of stuck with me till today. It was a really unsatisfying answer. And the answer was, Josh, it's just too hard for you to understand. And I was like, you know how it feels. And so that sort of kicked me off on sort of investigating and learning more and being really fascinated by how sort of simple systems can evolve into beautiful complexity. And I've also learned now that the industry that I'm in, which is retail banking, simple systems can end up with some really horrifying complexity as well. But I'll leave that for a little bit later. What's my next slide? This slide. Okay, so I then got involved in the electronic arts community in Australia. This is a machine that I built called Susan. I don't know why I called it Susan. I don't know anyone named Susan. I don't know why I named my machine, but this is Susan. And so what Susan is sort of this digital matrix mixer. You can put any sort of signal you want up the top, and other signals come out the bottom. So you can put audio in there or video in there. Had a fairly simple circuit internally that you could control sort of the way it would mix things by using these knobs. Now, I purposely didn't label the knobs because I like to take this thing to performances and let people just play with it and sort of explore the space without having any expectations about what was supposed to happen. And it was a really fun machine to build. The next slide is, I don't know why I included this slide. This is a gratuitous shot of the internals. You probably can't see it, but I think it's pretty. Then got better at building digital machines. This is a machine called Spoon. I don't know why I called it Spoon, but this is Spoon. Spoon was a sort of a variant of Susan, now involving microprocessors, better industrial design, but similar concept where you could plug signals in, get other weird signals out, and twist unlabeled knobs to see what happens. So I'd managed to sort of teach myself digital electronics. I'd started by sort of phones, then when you play with computers, digital electronics comes pretty naturally, given that progression of things. But I'd realized I didn't know much about how analog electronics worked. So that's the next thing I wanted to teach myself. And so that was this machine here. What you're seeing here, this is an audio filter. What an audio filter does is you take a signal and you either amplify or attenuate different parts of the frequency spectrum. Now, in the analog world, this circuit is a really simple circuit. You can do it from like a resistor and a capacitor, and you have an audio filter. You can use like inductors and op-amps to make something more complicated. But in the analog world, it's a really, really simple circuit. But I didn't understand analog electronics. I understood digital electronics. Now, in the digital world, an infinite impulse response filter, which is what this guy is, it's a really simple algorithm. But the circuitry that it runs on is actually pretty complicated because it's designed to run like on a microprocessor or a dedicated signal processing unit. So what I did is I decided to do something completely the wrong way, which was build a digital audio filter completely out of analog components, which is not the way you're supposed to do things, but it allowed me to take something from a domain I understood and apply it to a domain that I really didn't understand. And along the way, it involved a lot of trial and error to get this thing to even work or even to come close to working. But I managed to teach myself a fair bit about the finicky sort of rules of thumb that you need to construct a semi-functional analog circuit. It was noisy as fuck, but it did the job, and I learned a lot by doing it. Another gratuitous shot of the internals, probably explaining why it was noisy as fuck. I then moved to America. And when I came to America, I brought my video camera with me. It was like a pretty cool prosumer, I guess, class video camera that had a lens on the front, and it was like all-in-one camera thing. And it was the Christmas of 2004 or 2005 that I decided I wanted to replace the lens on the camera. Now, mind you, the camera wasn't designed to have a replaceable lens, but I had a screwdriver, I had a hacksaw, I had friends at IBM Lab in New York, which had laser cutters and 3D printers before we had things like MakerBot, which was a really convenient thing to have. So I took a bottle of rum, screwdriver and a hacksaw, and I took this thing apart and ended up attaching a lens to it. And I attached a 35mm lens and then realized that it doesn't quite work that way. I didn't know much about optics. Had to build a relay system, which is this big, long, phallic thing you see sticking out the front here. And ended up teaching myself optics and became sort of mini internet famous around this project. But the cool thing for me was that, you know, I wanted to do something. I didn't really know what I was doing. Had to learn a bunch of stuff along the way about optics and ended up building a cool machine. Next sort of project was I was working, running a quant group at a hedge fund in New York, and the fund was quite successful, and they were renovating their offices, and they were throwing out all of their old security cameras. So I asked, you know, can I keep the security cameras? And the office guy said, sure, why not? They knew I did sort of weird projects, and my thinking was I understood how like the lenses worked, but I didn't really understand much about how the signal that came out, what was going on there. Because I'd built machines in the past that did things with video performances, but they didn't really pay any respect to the underlying signal, and so their output was often pretty chaotic. So I wanted to do something a little bit more finessed. So I took the cameras home and sort of attached them to my oscilloscope, and what you see here in a blurry oscilloscope shot is the front part of an NTSC signal. They call this the front porch. I built some hardware to identify the different parts of that signal, which let me then take that signal apart and put it back together in a way that respected the underlying standard, and ended up with this machine, which I never actually named, but it was a sort of hybrid analog digital video mixer. And I got to do some cool performances with this, but the great thing for me was that I learned a hell of a lot about how the NTSC standard works, which totally makes me a hit with the girls at parties. So there's a common theme to sort of how I approach these projects, which is that I often start with a very academic understanding of how things are supposed to work. With my optical projects, I understood geometric optics. I used to be involved in the Physics Olympiad, and so you had these really simple rules like, you know, Newton's equations for focus to sort of tell you how a lens system is supposed to work. But there's a common thing, which is that when you start with this academic understanding and apply these rules, which are often shortcuts, the real world doesn't work that way. And all the gory, juicy bits come from the real world. So I wanted to understand why you know, the lenses that I was trying to build weren't working the way the equation said they should work. So I wrote this code in R, which is completely the wrong language for doing this sort of thing, but this is like a lens simulator that let me simulate the real properties of glass and see what was happening. And so I was sort of in this optics learning mode while sort of running a bank, and the Litro camera was announced. Do you guys know the Litro camera? Yeah, cool. So the Litro camera is a really cool camera. As soon as they announced it, I signed up saying, I have to get one of these things. These cameras are really cool because you can take a photo, and unlike other commercially available cameras, you can then focus the picture after you've taken the photo. And that was fascinating to me. I had no idea how that thing worked. The founder's thesis is online. It's a really interesting read. So I waited about a year before the camera got delivered to me, unboxed the camera, and saw this inside. A lot of you are probably familiar with this language, no user serviceable parts inside. And whenever I see that, I think that's just a big fuck you. Because sure, I may not have the skills to be able to fix something, but I certainly know how to break things. And the best talent that I have is sort of taking things in my hands and ripping it apart and looking at the guts and trying to come up with a model in my mind of how things at least are supposed to work, and then testing that model and seeing where I'm wrong. And I think that's just a really fabulous experience. So my Litro arrived, and about an hour later, I'd taken the top off, and it's kind of like flirting with it. Like, I'll take the top off and just see what happens. And then, you know, identified the lens system, realized it was a pretty standard lens system, looked at the circuitry behind it, but spent a lot of time looking at the image sensor, which is the cool thing about this camera. And sort of, you know, we were clothes off, everything going at this point. I broke a part of the camera in the process, and this was like 3 o'clock on a Friday morning or 3 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and I'd snapped off one of the power regulators while I was trying to push this thing back together, and thought, fuck, I've killed this camera now because I don't have the right soldering iron to fix this. But I took my soldering iron, a metal file, and I filed it down and managed to actually fix it, and ended up doing what I wanted to do, which is now my habit with cameras, which is building a 35mm lens mount for a Litro, which is kind of cool. So that involved taking out and reconfiguring the lens system internally and building some hardware to let you mount 35mm lenses on there. Took some cool photos. I can't do the zoomy thing with Litro on a screen, but cool photos. And that led me to put out this tweet, which is that in my line of work, it helps to have no fear of taking things apart. And my line of work is retail banking. And this is actually the tweet that Andy wanted me to talk about today. And so to understand the connection between sort of retail banking and sort of breaking stuff, you sort of have to understand my relationship to banking in America. So my relationship started with getting a 36, no, I didn't, with writing checks. So I came to America about 10 years ago and I had to pay my gas bill, and the way I had to do it was to take a pen and put it to a piece of paper to send money to the gas company. Now, I'd come to America because it's a country known for technological innovation, yet I'm putting pen to paper to send money around. I'd seen my parents use checks when I was a toddler. I'd never actually used one in Australia. That seemed kind of weird. Then came overdraft fees and late payment fees, and the realization that the relationship that I had with my bank was an adversarial relationship. So I stopped and I thought about this because I understand finance. That's why I came to America, is to go work in hedge funds and do finance sort of stuff. I understand the theoretical model of what a bank is supposed to do. I understand the socio and economic function that a bank is supposed to provide. But as a consumer of banking services, I wasn't feeling it. I was feeling something really different. And so I started thinking about this and sort of had this light bulb realization, which is that banks actually make money by keeping customers confused. That is the core part of the retail banking model. They make more money from fees and charges than they do from banking. So that inspired me to write this email to a friend of mine, Shamir, and a guy, Jerry, saying, hey, let's start a retail bank. And now I knew at this point that I had no idea what this really involved. But I knew that it was a problem. I knew that I had a pair of tools to break things, and why not give this thing a go? So we said, fuck it, let's do it. And we discovered a lot about banking technology, which is what I'll focus on in my next sort of 2 minutes. There's a lot of things that's messed up about banking, but I think technology will be interesting for this audience. So banking technology has sort of evolved in a completely parallel universe to the cool technology that we all know and love. We went and spoke to a few different vendors looking for partners who could help us build some stuff. And we're having these conversations, and they were saying that, look, we're the 800-pound gorilla in the space. Anything you want to do, we can do for you. And like, okay, cool, well, we need a real-time feed of your transactions and blah, blah, blah. And like, whoa, real-time feed of transactions? We can give you a batch file every night that has everything in it. It's EBCDIC encoded, but you'll have everything. And it's only going to be like on average 12 hours late. Like, that's not what we wanted to do. So we realized we had to get into the guts and rebuild a lot of the processing technology. I'm going to share with you a little sort of crazy story about what happens when you swipe a card at a store. When you swipe a card at a store, there's this standard, ISO 8583. It's an international standard. It's a standard that defines how bad standards can be. Because this is a standard that communicates card messages across the network. And so there are numbers that appear in this spec, like the dollar amount is an important number. Often that number is encoded as binary, sometimes big endian, sometimes little endian, but it's in there. Sometimes it's in there as an ASCII string. Quite often it's there as EBCDIC text. And you just have to know that when it's coming from this merchant network that it's going to be ASCII, and this merchant network it's going to be binary encoded. Now, given sort of the latency and the fragility of this network, they were smart enough to realize that a financial transaction should sort of copy the two-phase commit structure that you see. So what happens when you swipe your card at a store is that that store will ask the bank, is there enough money? And then a few days later, they'll come back to the bank saying, okay, now give us the money. Now, in the sort of design of this, I'm sure they have a really great reason, but there is absolutely no identifier tying those two legs of the transaction together. So what you find is that banks have all these rules and heuristics that try and guess which transactions sort of pair up in this two-phase commit. And this kind of blew my mind when I first heard it, but now I've come to peace with it because there's a lot more stuff about banking that's a lot more messed up. This protocol has lots of really useful, rich data in there that banks just throw out because they were designed for this sort of storage paradigm. Like we get zip codes for transactions. Often that zip code will have someone's name in there or a phone number, but most of the time it'll have a zip code in there. They just throw that shit out because who needs to know which zip codes you go to? We want to sort of fix this problem of banks making money by keeping customers confused. We want to sort of get rid of confusion. We want to take all the cool data that we can get from banking and make it a really enjoyable experience. But we wouldn't have been able to sort of tackle this problem if we didn't approach it sort of like hackers. We approached this problem the same way you would sort of debugging some code that had no comments or taking apart a machine that had no instructions. We sort of took apart each piece by piece, looked at the atomic units of banking, worked out what the inputs were, worked out what the outputs were, looked at what socioeconomic function was supposed to be served by that piece, and decided what we can build, what we can route around. And by taking this sort of very hackerish approach, we were able to do what we've been able to do. So the message that I really want to sort of leave you off with today, which is pretty simple, which is don't let your fear of breaking things stop you from identifying problems in this world and trying to fix them. Because you're not always going to be successful, but if you are, that's awesome. But even if you're not going to be successful, you're going to learn more about how the real world works, and that's pretty magical. So thanks so much. That's it for me.